Welcome to Martin Monday's Intentional Intimacy, where love, life, and legacy meet in the moments that matter most. Every week, I will share sacred reflections of my 30-year marriage before Martin's passing, as well as our life now without him. May these reflections help us live with more weight, warmth, and wisdom. Martin was a letter carrier by profession, but a life carrier by purpose. So let's take a moment and let intentional intimacy speak. Good day, good day. This is Paula. Welcome to episode 16 of Martin Monday's Intentional Intimacy. In this episode, Likeness and Legacy, I'd like to share a story about what happened to me one day when I was driving to Martin's job to pick him up. And I just like to reflect. I think so much of what's going on in today's society with, the relationships and with how we relate to one another, I think this story will actually kind of be fitting. So, as you know, Martin and I, we're married now. We have our son. MJ's a baby, and we still only had the one car. We muddled through with that one car for quite some time. And so I'm driving to pick up Martin from work, and I have MJ in his car seat in the back of the car, and the car started having some trouble. And I realized that I was not going to make it all the way to Martin's job. And so I saw like this little store, little look like a little mom and pop, kind of like, general convenience type store. And so I decided to pull over into that parking lot so that I could, be in a safe space and, hopefully maybe just go inside and, grab something to calm the baby until Martin kind of got there. And so, sure enough, I pull into this parking lot. I get MJ out of the car. And so I go into this convenience store and I'm walking through aisle by aisle. It's like I said, it was like kind of like a mom and pop little local grocery store, convenience type store with, little products and different things. But some of it, some of those types of stores are kind of neat because you can find things there that you don't find in other places. So I'm really taking in aisle by aisle and looking at the unique offerings that they have. And I figure, I'll pick up a few little items as well. But as I'm going from aisle to aisle, I'm noticing that the store owner, she keeps watching me. Now, I'm an African American woman. This was not an African American owned store. I'm not going to politicize or say per se what the nationality was of the store owner, but I'll just say it was not an African American owned store. And so I'm walking through from aisle to aisle, and she's constantly watching me in every aisle and what I'm doing. And at first, I ignored it. You always want to give people the benefit of the doubt and you don't want to make assumptions, but after a while, after aisle after aisle after aisle, you keep watching me, my radar and my antenna is going up. And so it gets to the point where, because first she was kind of like behind the counter, and then she came from behind the counter. And as I'm walking aisle to aisle, she's kind of walking aisle to aisle too, like kind of watching me. So then finally I said to her, I said, "Excuse me, ma'am, is there a problem?" She's like, "Oh, no problem, no problem." And I'm like, "Well, okay." And so I let it go. So I continued on, going from aisle to aisle. And she's still watching me. So I finally said, "Excuse me, ma'am." I said, "I think there's a problem." I said, "You're making me feel very uncomfortable." I said, "Because you're continuing to watch me in the store." I said, "I'm not doing anything, that would cause alarm." I said, "And you're making me, feel very uncomfortable here in the store as you're constantly watching me." And so she's like, "Oh, no, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I don't mean any harm." She's like, "I just keep looking at your baby." I'm like, "My baby?" She's like, "Yeah." She's like, "Your baby." She's like, he reminds me so much of, our singing mailman, right? And so she looks at her husband and she's like, "What's his name, honey? The mailman that sings, what's his name?" And he's like, "Marty." She's like, "Yeah, yeah." She's like, "Your baby reminds me so much of our singing mailman, Marty." So what was feeling like hardness in my mind at that point completely softened. And I looked at her and I said, "Oh." I said, "Well, I think my baby reminds you of your singing mailman, Marty, because this is Marty's son. This is Martin Jr." Oh my God. You would have thought it was a family reunion. Family reunion. You would have thought, because these people gravitated to me like I was a long lost relative that they were overjoyed to find. I mean, she's like, "Oh my God, this is Marty's baby." And like they were so like excited to see me. And I had told her that, the car was having problems and I had called Martin and I was waiting for him to come and everything. And she's like, "Oh no." She's like, "Come on, come on." So they took what was in my basket. They took me inside because, like I said, this was like a mom and pop grocery store, but it was attached to their home. So they took me inside their home. They're like, "You can wait for Marty here." She's like, "He'll be here and whatever you need for the baby, whatever." Gave me something to drink and offered me something to eat and the whole nine, making me comfortable, like doting on me like I'm some celebrity or something. And they're like, "Oh no, whatever. Make sure you're okay." Complimentary, whatever the things I had already gathered in my basket, that was comped, and they're giving it to me. And so a few minutes later, Martin gets there and they're like, "Marty," like it was, I'm like, "What does this man do on his mail route? Like with these people? Like, my God." And so it was just like this huge reunion. They were so excited. And, Martin got the car fixed and all that situated. But I just couldn't believe the level of response um, once they realized who I was. And then my softening once I realized who they were and what their intentions are. And that's what I want to focus on in the reflection. I'll catch you on the other side. Okay, welcome to the reflection. So, episode 16, reflection. There's a lot I could probably say. And even when I tell this story, I mean, we're talking over 30 years, 32, 33 years ago, this story, but it just always resonates. And quite honestly, it's still applicable even today. I'm just going to make three key points in the reflection because I think that they probably will drive home significantly the points I want to make. So, the first point I want to make is a good reputation can walk into rooms that you've never stepped into. The Bible talks about a good reputation is better than riches, and so Martin's good reputation and how he presented himself walked me into rooms that I had never been into just by virtue of association with who he is and what he was. I was treated a certain way because of how he had presented himself and his interactions with other people. So it is very important that how we conduct ourselves, it creates fruitfulness, and as a result, it ends up impacting not just our lives, but it impacts those that are part of our lives as well. And so it's very important for us to establish a good reputation. The second point I want to make is that assumptions, I like to say assumptions because the word assume truly spells, what can happen when you make assumptions, what you make out of you and me. But those assumptions, they actually melt when clarity enters. Once it's clear, once we understand, all that stuff goes out the window because, from my perception, I was no longer a perceived shoplifter, or someone that was being racially profiled because that's not where the woman was coming from. But I was making that assumption about her based on my lived experiences. Now, I'm not saying, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that that doesn't happen because come on, let's be real, it does. But that is not what this particular thing was all about. And so my lived experience created an assumption and created an expectation of what was happening that quite honestly was not what was happening. And so once clarity came into the room, those assumptions completely melted away, because that was no longer the case. And that was just so significant. Like, it was just kind of amazing, how that happened. And then the third point I want to make is that the way that you treat people becomes an inheritance that your family receives. And that kind of relates to the first point in some regard, but it is different in another regard because, sometimes we don't know we're being treated a certain way, or like we have our name, your last name is your heritage. And, my kids often say, I'm a Hollis. There's a certain way that I'm supposed to conduct myself. There's a certain expectation that's associated with me as a Hollis. I would say that often for my family. I'm Evangelist K and Deacon K's daughter, and there's a certain expectation to how I'm supposed to carry myself. And when I'm handling or behaving outside of that, I'm influencing our family legacy. I'm influencing our family name. I'm influencing the inheritance that it leaves. And so I want you guys to think about that. What legacy is your name building? Not just the name that you inherit because of your parents, but your specific name, whatever that is. What kind of legacy is that building, and how is that influencing those in your immediate sphere of influence and those that are impacted by those in your sphere of influence? And so I just think that it's very telling that we, analyze that and that we're mindful of it, and so everything that we might want to do isn't something that we should do because of the impact. And so I just want to humanize this whole perspective, because at the end of the day, sometimes we pass judgment. Like I said, I was guilty of passing a judgment on this person, but let's humanize life. Because at the end of the day, all of our bodily functions are all still red, yellow, and brown, right? And so that humanizes us, and that unifies the human experience of who and what we are. And so if we can keep a humanizing perspective in things, we can minimize, some of the disparaging remarks and disparities that exist within our communities. Like I said, I'm not minimizing and I'm not denying that those things exist, but let's not lead with that. Let's lead with the humanizing factors, the things that make us united, far more united than we are divided. And so likeness and legacy is important. And just be mindful of that in places and spaces where you go. Thanks so much for joining this week. I'll catch you next week. Martin Mondays continues on Tuesday with the Tuesday Tea. Check it out and join me and take a sip. Martin used to say a lot of things. Some were funny, some were wise, but one thing he often said was, wow. Wow. Just those 3 letters. It spoke volumes. It meant a lot. When he didn't know what to say, wow. When he was excited about something, wow. When he was confused, perhaps, or even frustrated, he said, wow. And he's still saying wow. Through this bracelet, he's still saying wow, because he's still saying, may your whole life prove that God is good. And so in closing, that's my hope for you this week. May you have wow moments as you too are living out legacy. Live in the wow. Live in the reality of knowing that your whole life is good. Live in the heartbeat of Martin Mondays and intentional intimacy. May that anchor you in this week as you build legacy, one wow, one moment at a time. See you next week.